This video is about writing Groovy scripts to manipulate macros and then calling them from RapidMiner using the execute script operator. Specifically, the video shows how to change macros in a Groovy script. This is often useful if you can't quite get the generate macro operator to do precisely what you want. This doesn't happen very often. The video also shows how to access macros, which is useful if you, say, want to check the presence of a macro and that it has a value in a certain range. To help with this, the creation of an example set is shown, and this example set contains the names and values of macros, which allows them to be processed by other RapidMiner operators. So we'll cover three things. We'll create some macros, then we'll access the names and values of macros, and then we'll output an example set that happens to contain these macro names and values. All of this done with Groovy. So it's a very simple script. Here it is. So you'll notice that I'm showing here the script. We're also seeing some predefined macros in the process context. So the first one is, let's look at the actual Groovy. Very simple, actually. In fact, you could get it down to 2 lines. Well, even better, 1 line actually. So the first line is simply to import this Java class to let me make a date later on in a variable. But the essence of how to add a new macro with a given name is simply you have to define a variable, and I've just defined a string here called my macro with the value hello world in it, and then I'm simply passing it to this function add macro, which is in the context of the operator, the process that we're executing in, then there's some sort of macro handling function, and then within that there's a property, a method, beg your pardon, to add a macro. So simply you just call this here with a name, which is whatever the name is you want the macro to be, and then the value, and of course that could even be 1 line if you wanted. And here's another example where I'm defining a variable called date. So I'm defining a variable called today, which is set to today's date and time, and then I'm simply adding another macro called today, and you'll notice I've converted the argument to a string by using this syntax here, toString with parentheses. Anyway, the end result of this, 2 new macros will be created, my macro and today, and with values as shown here. So if I set a breakpoint after this execute script, we'll notice additional macros will be created. Let's just see that happening. Sure enough, so my macro is hello world, and also today is, it's the September the 9th, Tuesday the September the 9th, it's 5 to 9 in the evening. Okay, so that's very simple. The next part is we're going to look at actually accessing the names and values of macros. Slightly more complicated. So basically, I'm going to do 2 things in this script. I'm actually going to create an example set and output the names and values of macros into that new example set. So the first part is, this is how you create an example set. This is an empty example set with 2 attributes. One's called macro name, one's called macro value. This line essentially creates it in memory, and this thing lets you add new rows to the thing in memory. And then the actual effort of getting the names and values of macros is done here. So there's this function called getDefined macro names in the context of the process and macro handler. This, I think, gets you all of the macros you have in your current process, not the reserved ones. There are some reserved macros like %A, %B, and so on. It doesn't get those ones. So basically it gets you a list of all of the macro names, and then you can look up the value of the macro by simply calling this function here with the name you've just got. And then what we then do is we put those values into this array, which is called strings. It's a 2-element array of type string, and then using this syntax here you create a new row of the values, the name and the value pair, and you tack that onto the attributes thing that you've created at the beginning here, and then you can add that new row to the example set in memory. And then, having iterated over all combinations of macro name, you then write the example set and return it. So it's relatively simple. So if I again set a breakpoint here, what we will see now are these macros output as an example set. So I'll run that. Sure enough, there's the macro name and macro value, and if I bring in the macro view and just adjust its size so we don't go too mad on squinting at it, so you can sort of satisfy yourself. If I sort that column there, we should see they're identical. Yes, indeed. Okay, so very simple process actually, but the ability to create new macros and manipulate the values of existing ones can be extremely useful, and so well worth knowing how to do that.